Let's go!
Kind of like a post-mortem Street Fighter 3 developer interview made for the 15th anniversary of the Street Fighter Limited Edition DVD. Noritaka Funamizu, Hidetoshi Ishizawa discussed the challenges of designing everything new between characters, parries, and everything with English subs. Beautiful. This is an interview with the Street Fighter devs, like after the fact, after the Street Fighter 3 series had concluded. Mostly considered to be, you know, not the most lucrative of the Street Fighter franchise. The first two versions of Street Fighter 3 did not do well financially, and then eventually Street Fighter 3 Third Strike would eventually do pretty well. So I'm kind of curious to see directly from the horse's mouth, right, what they say. Carry the torch of the mainline series. Development took far longer than expected. Frustrating and worrying the fans. Also, the Vaseline on the screen was an issue. Super Street Fighter 2X, so that was Super Turbo. I didn't want to be involved in the making of Street Fighter 3. Vision for the Street Fighter clash with the rest of the teams. Wow. Everything about this game was a fucking disaster at the start. So they're talking about using the new arcade board, CPS3. Got held up by the difficulty by designing brand new characters. Wanted to do new things like motion capture, and that further slowed us down. Desire to do something new slowed us down. That was probably the biggest reason for the delay. Wow. I was involved on all the Street Fighter 3 games. I believe I joined the first development after Vampire Savior, just before that I forget. I was originally just there to help out. But no one explained to me what we were supposed to be doing. Yeah, like, this is like the same thing with Matt McMuscle's video we watched like a year ago. A hilarious amount of like mismanagement that happened at the beginning of the development of the Street Fighter 3 series of Street Fighter 3 New Gen, where it didn't even start off as a Street Fighter game. What the concept of the game even was, I got a sense of what they wanted just by feeling things out as they went. But ultimately, there was this big question of what direction should we go. Stoic vibe of Street Fighter, we wanted to continue with 3. That was kind of all we had. And with the visuals too, it was just non-stop experimenting. Character design, however, was proving to be a major impediment. So what was going on with the characters then? Ryu wasn't in the game at first, and neither was Chun-Li. Team felt like they were making a brand new Street Fighter, so they wouldn't need Ryu or Chun-Li. So they were going to make a new lead character. So this is like, I wonder if we could get final confirmation on this, because I got shit for so long about this story, where some people would be super mad, because I used to talk about how very early versions of Third Strike like didn't have Shotos, right? They just did not have Ken and Ryu. So early on, it didn't resonate. They were actually added like after the fact on top of like new characters. Alex was like the primo new character, right? I heard that from literal Capcom employees, right? I heard about that from Capcom employees directly that had not gone on record and specifically said that shit. So I got like a lot of crap over the years about telling that story, how like, yeah, the Street Fighter 3 games originally didn't have the Shotos, right? It did not have Ken and Ryu and Chun-Li and stuff like that. Obviously, Chun-Li was added way later. So anyway, yeah, it's crazy I got shit for that, because even people had heard of this, and there was like some people that were like, you're spreading false information. And it's like, well, I mean, I heard this from people that were on the inside. But people wanted like quotes, right? People wanted there to be a finite quote from somebody taking responsibility at either Capcom USA or Capcom Japan that was or not the case. And it was just something that I just have heard forever, that the game launched or didn't launch, but in early versions during playtesting, just didn't have traditional Street Fighter characters, and they eventually added them later. So anyway, they're gonna make a new lead, which was Alex. Plan was to change the main character of Street Fighter. For after about 2 years, Okamoto told us that if this is a Street Fighter game, it's got to have Ryu. So 2 years into development, right? When these arcade games would take tops like 6 to 9 months. Like they would pump them the fuck out. So it took 2 years for them to eventually stick like Ryu into the game. I'm sure that's what people outside of development thought too. That without Ryu, it just wouldn't be a Street Fighter game. But the team had worked so hard up in that original vision, and then I wanted to protect that. So there you go. The long-running rumor. And I don't know if it was like public location tests, but back in these times, they would consistently bring in like top players in the Japanese community to go check out games. And I don't know if it was like at a public location test where they gave people the ability to play the game and Ken and Ryu were not in it. But that was the understanding, was that at some point during development when people were trying it, the game didn't even have Ken or Ryu. And they eventually had to add those characters in at some point, because people were just thrown off by it. They just hated the fact that it didn't have any of the old characters. And finally, we got confirmation of that directly from a friggin' Capcom employee. It probably came from this interview. After all these years, this mystery, like, finally actually resolved. Like, who eventually said that the game didn't have, like, you know, old Capcom characters? We're talking about parrying. Would call it blocking in Japan. A number of major issues. Nature of these perplexing problems. Oh, good. We added the parry system at the beginning, but we hadn't fully thought it through. I think the team wanted something with a lot of variety in the mechanics. The subtleties of positioning that could really emerge in fights. That was quite difficult to do in 2D. Yeah, this was when the 3D revolution was kind of happening with fighting games. Like, most fighting games were moving to 3D. This was like 1997. You throw a punch from here and one step back. They wanted the mechanics to accommodate that. But in Street Fighter 2, it was ultimately a digital game, in the Zero series especially. Digital? Digital? They wanted it to feel more analog, in other words. I think that's what they wanted. Weird. What a weird... It's all a bit vague. If we'd been more clear on that intention from the start, we might have succeeded a lot sooner. It's like phrasing, digital to analog. In early Street Fighter 2, you could fake out your opponent just by crouching. It's an important part of the game back then. By the time Alpha came around, the aspect of the gameplay had dropped off. But I think it's a big part of Street Fighter 3 still. I think that's the gameplay we should have been pursuing. It was only helping out then. But I think if I hadn't experienced that in the first Street Fighter 3, the later iterations wouldn't have turned out as they did. The team really was confused and didn't know what they were supposed to be doing. This is Neo G, right, chat? Right? This is Neo G, isn't it? He looks so young. Yeah, it is. Okay. This is the guy that essentially designed the battle system for the majority of Capcom games. I ran into him at the last Evo that was in person, 2019. So it was like, last time I saw him in person, he was like, it was 20 years, this is like 20 years younger. But overall, the balance, even with the developer ended, we didn't know if we were on the right path, and then time was up. The deadline came and I said you have to release it now, no matter what. You guys keep going like this, it won't be released for 5 years, it would never end. Capcom told us just to release this one and take in all the feedback. Huh. And at the time, it was already decided that we'd be making a second Street Fighter 3. So Second Impact was already planned. I mean, obviously, right? Obviously. Trial and error, the development team finally pushed Street Fighter 3 across the finish line. The response from players, however, was quite surprising. Yeah, New Gen was a fucking disaster. The criticism was harsh and unrelenting. It was a fucking disaster. And here's the thing. I know we talked about this before with the Matt McMuscles video. Nobody played it. Nobody played Street Fighter 3. Either it was a lack of like marketing hindsight, or you know, the fact that the roster was messed up, or so many other things at the launch of the game. Nobody played this shit. At arcades, it just was an unplayed game. Almost as unplayed as like Street Fighter the movie, the game. That's how crazy it was. You would eventually get people to tune into like, you know, a Second Impact cabinet over time as that eventually came out. But genuinely, I'm not even kidding you. Like, New Generation Street Fighter 3 Part 1 was as unplayed as the Street Fighter the movie, the game cabinets. I'm not even kidding you, man. There were too many other games that were too good, because this game fucking sucked. People were like, what the fuck is this? We waited so long and this is what you're calling Street Fighter 3? I guess that's something we really have to apologize for. There's a headache for us as the devs, and we passed that confusion on to the players. They didn't know how to play it. Yeah, it sold around 1,000 arcade machines compared to Street Fighter 2's 300,000 arcade machines. Wow. Yeah, it was an unmitigated disaster. And we've heard some direct stories from Capcom USA employees, and even otherwise Japanese employees in some Polygon interviews, I believe. And no, it was really bad. Like, there's a reason Street Fighter went away for a very long time after the Street Fighter 3 series. It was bad. Just because of bad mechanics? No, a lot of shit. Like, it wasn't the visual upgrade that people wanted. It wasn't the characters that people wanted. The game also felt... Street Fighter 3 New Gen is also a really weird feeling game. And then on top of it, the marketing of it was bad. The visuals are amazing. So here's the thing. They are. With hindsight and retrospect, yes, the visuals in Street Fighter 3, any of them are really good. Here's the problem, though. In 1997, fighting games were moving away from that. Fighting games were moving away from 2D visual style. By that time, it was feeling outdated. Yes, exactly. So people are saying the same thing. By that time, they were moving away from the old 2D style, and 3D fighting games were really starting to take over. So people were expecting Capcom to deliver what was essentially a Namco or a Sega level 3D fighting game with as much fluidity and movement and an essential motion capture and all this stuff that those games had. And Capcom was essentially sticking to good old 2D. So there was the new hotness at the time, and Capcom was not conforming. They essentially dug in deep with the fact that their new CPS3 hardware was going really ham on 2D graphics still. And they just didn't look as impressive to other games, you know? And EX. Street Fighter EX was made outside of Capcom, technically. And I can tell you from without a doubt, Street Fighter EX was always the black sheep. I liked it, but I like Street Fighter EX plus Alpha, right? I thought it was a fun game. But anyone that grew up with the Street Fighter games in the 90s will tell you that the Street Fighter EX games were like black sheep. They were looked upon as in like, oh, that's that weird offshoot Street Fighter thing. Ugh. Like, that isn't, I mean, some of us will argue that we like it, right? And I think, once again, they have aged pretty well. I think they're actually pretty fun. But they always looked worse than the other 3D games at the time. And they always felt like cheaper mechanically. So, while they're not bad, by the retrospective zeitgeist that Street Fighter had existed in, was Street Fighter EX the proper upgrade to the Street Fighter 3 series people wanted? No. No, it felt cheap by comparison. The team announced the upcoming release of Second Impact. Second Impact feels so much better than new gen. It's fucking crazy, dude. Like, there's not a really big visual change. Most of the backgrounds are the same, right? They add some more backgrounds. This is in Capcom 90s heyday. They would always have their series of games between Street Fighter, Darkstalkers, and like Marvel vs. Capcom, where they would have like 3 versions, right? 3 versions, where the first 2 versions are pretty similar, but essentially expand on mechanic stuff, right? But a lot of the visuals are the same shit. So the backgrounds are very similar. The characters look really similar. The games play pretty similar. Not until the 3rd version of the game comes out, the Third Strikes, the Vampire Saviors, the MVC1s, do they really overhaul all this shit. They're just like, fuck it. Like, throw the wrench in there. We're going to go crazy. And then the 3rd versions of the games are fantastic. They're spectacular. They really upgrade. Yeah, Alpha 1 to Alpha 2 to Alpha 3 is a pretty good comparison. But Alpha 2 felt genuinely different than Alpha 1. I think the Alpha series felt really different from 1 to 2 and 3. But this is one of those examples of the first 2 games being like kind of mid, if not a miss. And then the 3rd game just knocking it out of the park, like Vampire Savior, as well as MVC1, you know? Are they content with the serious issues of the previous game? First question I asked myself was, what is parrying supposed to be really? The analysis was pretty much all I did on Second Impact. But this time I was elevated by the main planner. Or to the main planner. There's actually another main, so it was more of like a shared role. He worked on solving other problems, while I confined myself to analyzing the parry system. I had a fundamental question. What is the proper role in parrying in a game like this? What is the game really about? I eventually started to get a hazy idea of that answer. Around that time Hugo was finished, new characters were done, the whole roster was assembled. We just happened to start the test player bug checking process. I didn't exactly do any test playing myself. But while that was ongoing, I talked at length with the test players about what they wanted the game to be. And in the course of those conversations and talks with the internal team, I finally started to see what the gameplay of Second Impact should be. Yeah. And you feel that because parrying in new gen feels whack. Like, if you parry something in new gen, it just feels like shit. Even if you successfully get a parry and you make the right read, it doesn't result in the things you think it should. Which feels bad. Second Impact essentially feels like a not as good Third Strike. It's getting there, right? It's a substantial upgrade over the previous game. To the point where if you've played a bit of Third Strike, you can go and play Second Impact and have a bit of fun. It's genuinely like a really good game. The problem is that Street Fighter 3 is arguably one of the best feeling fighting games of all time, where they had to fuck up so bad in part 1, they spent the entirety of part 2 just figuring out what the fuck is our game even supposed to be, completely like overanalyze and redistribute the thought process of how the hell does this game even play, figure it out, spend an entire game figuring that out to get Third Strike. And then that's when Third Strike comes to be one of the most like well-known fighting games, because it took 2 games to get to that point. It really took like a lot of time and a lot of fucking up to make the game feel as good as it did. And to be honest, Third Strike would not be the game that it is today if it wasn't for the first game being as bad as it was. So you can almost thank New Gen for being like the sacrificial lamb for turning Street Fighter 3 Third Strike into the game it is, because it made them figure that shit out. They were forced into a corner and they had to like bully their way out of there to figure that shit out. Revising parry is one of the biggest challenges of Second Impact. How did the team go about improving the incomplete aspects of that system? Realization was our big mistake with parries. We had to try to make all parries be all about the ultimate defense, when in fact, it was actually more offensive. It wasn't until the end of Second Impact's development that I realized parrying was supposed to be a way to lead into an attack. It was a light bulb went off, so that's what it is. And yeah, you feel it, right? In new gen, it's a defensive mechanic. It's like a get off me thing. When you parry something in new gen, you almost push the opponent away from you. You almost like use it as almost like it's like a difficult version of a push block. So when you would parry like a jump in attack and you're jumping in and you want to use to like I'm gonna parry your anti-air. No kidding. If somebody DPs you and you parry the DP, your character doesn't go down for a punish. You go flying back and the person just DPs. You're like, what the fuck? It feels so weird. It literally is used as like a get off me kind of thing instead of like I'm getting in. And that was the realization that, oh, it's not a defensive mechanic. It's both. We should make it both.
I think
it's easy to confuse someone in a trap move, pose, and parrying. When you think about it, the pose one makes when doing a trap move has a visual tell. It lets you know, watch out, do not strike now. But you don't know when your opponent parried. So in a way, it's like that old game children play when they create a trap by digging a hole and covering it with grass. Yeah, parrying has no whiff animation. Like, it's not the same thing as like Street Fighter 5 parrying, which Ryu kind of gets, which Gil gets, right? Where they actually go into a pose. Parrying in, Street Fighter 6, you have to enter a pose. It has a startup and it has a recovery. You see it happen, right? That's different. Like, they're talking about it being a trap where you don't even know it's going to be there. So it's a unique mechanic where the result does not happen until it actually collides with the opponent, which is why they're describing it as being like a trap. Like, you don't see it at all. It's a pitfall trap. It may seem like a defense, but it's actually a form of an attack. When I realized that, the second impact of element all fell into place. At that time, I still couldn't describe the system the way I could today. It was just the key concept of offense that they were grasping. And that led up to third strike. I had to use the bathroom, chat. I'm excited. This has me riveted. Give me a second. Continue. Second impact revised the parrying. It was soon followed by third strike, which can still be found in arcades today. Many behind-the-scenes stories from the developers that can now be told. For the next game, I knew I could handle it on my own. And we didn't need as many people, so I made that request. Timing-wise, I think it was when we announced Second Impact. I could think of it. I stupidly blurted out that we were making a third game when Second Impact was announced. Actually, I can tell you this story now. When we were making Second Impact, I spoke with main programmer and several others. I learned that there was problems with the character data. Character what? Piece of shit. With the character data parameters of Second Impact. I discussed those issues with the programmer at great length, and I became very familiar with the internal side. Since I had a direct line of communication, I got the okay from above. We're going to change up the system in a big way for the next game, and I asked him to make preparations for that. Hot topic around third strike was the return of Chun-Li. You can reveal the interesting story behind that decision. You're bugging Okamoto about adding Chun. I think adding her was a must if we were going to make a third game. And then, since we were thinking Third Strike would have a big roster, it was all the more insistent. Without her, it wouldn't have the same impact. For Okamoto, she was the face of Capcom. Her absence was the #1 complaint from players. Heard it over and over, what the hell? It's not Chun-Li if it's Street Fighter, yeah? They were like, just put her in already. The staff also wanted to see her added. We genuinely wanted to add her. This is why she gets this is why Chun is so fucking good, right? This is why she's so good in the game, because everybody wanted her to be in it and she just wasn't in it for so many versions. This is why Chun is so fucking good. There's definitely some bias going on there. She's godlike in that game. They literally made the greatest footsie character of all time. She's so fucking good. It's insane. Arguably some of the best normals in fighting game history, man. Especially the return of Chun-Li. Third Strike's gameplay received a massive update in the form of the guard parry. Red parry. How was this emblematic system created? We declared we were going to reevaluate things from the ground up, much like they did in 03. So yeah, going back to that. But for the Zero series, they really did re-examine everything. So it was like, okay, we're going to do the same thing. This is ultimately why, like, the final versions of games at Capcom, they're just like, hey, you know what? We're just going to figure out all this shit and do it a different way. Third Strike, we'd finally gotten a handle on parry. And I asked the programmers to make the data easier for me to work with. It was all at the same time, and then we came to the parry system. We had an idea for the different patterns for parrying, including the original parry. It took a great deal of experimentation, and even after all that, what we came up with felt somewhat lacking, like it was missing something. So they added red parry. Not long before the Zero team had been stuck on the alpha counter, we started getting into some very granular level conversations about that. One of the programmers told me that he hated was having to yank the joystick back and back again while blocking. It came before the idea of the guard parry. You know how you block an attack? And to execute a super art, that tiny recovery window? You have to frantically move the joystick back and forth. He hated that motion. He wanted us to do away with the jail situations where you're forced to block the whole time. The idea sounded interesting, so I said, let's do that. What if in that instant, okay, what if in that instant you could parry? Basically, you give up your guard to perform a parry. It was a cool idea, we started playing around with it. Really cutting into the time we had allocated on working on the parry system, to be honest. It was really fun, so we kept going with it. It's funny, it's because it's one of the hardest inherent mechanics in a fighting game. Like, there's very few mechanics that require such precise, like, timing than a fucking red parry in Third Strike that is built inherently into the system that is supposed to be like an accessible fighting game, right? It's so fucking hard to do. There's this feeling of, oh, the other Street Fighter games did it this way. The guard recovery time in Street Fighter V is this long, we can't change that, we mustn't touch that. That kind of attitude of being hesitant to change those things was the most debilitating mental pattern that we got stuck in. I can really see that now. It said that the history of 2D fighting games, which began with the birth of Street Fighter in 1987, reached the pinnacle with the release of Third Strike. How do they feel about that public opinion? Damn, this was in 2003? So this was 4 years... Jesus, this is how revered Third Strike is, chat. Even 4 years after the release of Third Strike, it wasn't like, this is 1 year before the Daigo parry, right? So 20 years ago, Third Strike was already so highly revered, and I can tell you this is true. This game was difficult as shit to be good at, but it was also like so heavily regarded in the industry and the community as being like this is the best fighting game, right? Oh, the Third Strike is like the best fighting game. It is, the Third Strike is what counts type shit. I don't really feel that way. There's still very few things being developed today, after all. Reminded you what you said about Street Fighter 2X. Did you exhaust all your ideas with Third Strike? I actually don't feel that way. There's still lots more to mess around with. When we finished Third Strike, I had time to reflect on its shortcomings. And on the Dreamcast port, I decided to go all in on my experimentations. Ah, that's right. The Dreamcast port gets all these crazy dip switch options. I forgot about that. It gets all these like funky things you can change in the game. Made a version that incorporated my experimental ideas. Yeah, System Direction was the name of that version. Although it didn't make it into the final commercial release ultimately. I feel like, what was System Direction in the Dreamcast version, or was that eventually in the PlayStation 2 version? Right? Maybe the PS2 version is what eventually got that. Is it both? You can see a glimpse of those efforts in the System Direction feature of the Dreamcast port. Well, there you go. Way to mess around with the mechanics. Internally, we were making our own personal version of Street Fighter 3 then too. We had a lot of time to think. So just like with the parry system, we had a number of ideas that were really questioning the fundamental aspects of the game. Why is it like that? Why does it have to be that way? And in that sense, there was some real concern that some of these ideas shouldn't be done for Street Fighter 3. Maybe they should be used for different fighting games. And that happens a lot in video game development, especially when you work for like a big company, where it's like, should you use this idea for the 4th iteration of a game series that has had a, you know, a varying amount of success? No, we should save that for something later, you know? Save it for something later. Next generation could be 3D. That's how out there some of our ideas were. There's definitely more things I'd like to do. The main programmer I mentioned, he felt the same way. That's always how it is, though. Everyone has one more thing they'd like to do. Save it for the next game. Basically satisfied with where things ended up with Street Fighter 3. Damn, and it's just over! Jesus, why is my autoplay on? Who are these weird guys talking about weird shit? Where's the autoplay? Autoplay. Well, that was an absolute fucking wonderful interview. Right? I'm gonna thumbs that shit up. That was an absolute wonderful interview. Like really getting into the nitty-gritty of probably one of the biggest disasters in Capcom history. That essentially turned into one of their most celebrated games of all time, you know? And it's cool to hear, like, right from the horse's mouth, like, how much shit that they had to do, how much shit that they had to deal with to eventually get out of that situation. To ultimately show that, yeah, like, games will just die in pre-production, where there's just weird management, where there's, like, not a clear focus on what something is supposed to be. This is very cool. You know, it's just cool to see how Third Strike ended up being.